Judge William Hale had seen countless cases come through his courtroom. As a seasoned judge in his early 50s, he had developed a methodical, almost mechanical way of handling cases. Each day felt the same. People filed in. He passed judgment, and then it was on to the next. The cases weren't always easy, but they were predictable. Today, like so many before, he was focused on keeping the docket moving, ruling quickly, and maintaining order in his courtroom. As the morning light filtered through the windows, the next case was called Naomi Bennett versus the City of Riverton. A woman in her early 30s, Naomi walked into the courtroom with a calm and confident stride. Her presence was steady, and her professional attire conveyed a sense of quiet strength. She looked every bit the part of someone who belonged in a boardroom, not a courtroom. "Ms. Bennett, you're charged with failure to comply with local parking ordinances," Judge Hale said, his voice flat as he looked over the case file. The charge was minor. A routine traffic violation that typically resulted in a small fine. He wasn't expecting any drama today. He briefly glanced up at Naomi, who was already standing at the podium. Naomi's eyes met his, her expression calm, though there was a glimmer of concern behind them. She spoke, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to explain that there were extenuating circumstances on the day of the violation. I wasn't parked in an illegal spot deliberately. I had a medical emergency and couldn't move my car immediately. I understand the importance of following the law, but I would appreciate some understanding given the circumstances." Judge Hale didn't flinch. He had heard similar explanations 1,000 times. "Ms. Bennett, I'm sure your situation was difficult, but this is not a matter that requires further explanation. You've had similar infractions before, and I'm inclined to believe this is more about a failure to follow the rules than an isolated incident." He flipped through the file again, muttering under his breath as he scanned the details. "I'm issuing a fine of $250. Court is adjourned." Naomi's heart sank. She had hoped for a bit of leniency, a chance to explain herself fully. But Judge Hale's decision came quickly and without much thought. There was no real effort to understand her side of the story, no real consideration for the context she had presented. She felt a wave of frustration rising inside her, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said politely, even as she felt the sting of the decision. With a nod, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her steps slower now as she weighed the situation. Outside, as Naomi made her way to her car, she was already planning her next steps. She had worked too hard, advocated for too many important causes, to let this unfair ruling stand. What she didn't know yet was that this minor court appearance, one she had expected to be routine, was about to take a turn she could never have predicted. She wasn't just any woman walking out of that courtroom. She was Naomi Bennett, the leader of a prominent federal diversity initiative, and her story was about to take center stage. Naomi sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing. The judge's decision stung more than she had expected. Not because of the fine itself, it was hardly a sum she couldn't afford, but because of the dismissive way Judge Hale had treated her. In a world that often overlooked her, that lack of empathy felt all too familiar. As the engine hummed to life, Naomi's thoughts shifted. She wasn't just someone who could let a situation like this slide. She had built her career around fighting for fairness, for respect, and for the voices of those who often went unheard. Over the past 5 years, Naomi had become a recognized leader in a federal diversity initiative aimed at transforming hiring practices and pushing for equal representation within government agencies. She had worked tirelessly to elevate marginalized communities and ensure that diversity wasn't just a buzzword, but a core value within the country's most powerful institutions. Her role was strategic, working with lawmakers, corporate leaders, and government officials to make systemic changes. It was a job that came with high expectations, long hours, and the weight of public scrutiny. Yet, despite the pressure, Naomi had earned her place. She had spoken at conferences, contributed to policy papers, and led initiatives that had made real, tangible changes. But none of that mattered today in that courtroom. In the eyes of Judge Hale, she wasn't a leader in federal policy. She was just another person who had made a mistake. The thought irked her, but she was determined to make sure the judge and the public knew the full story. The court case, which had started as a simple parking violation, was about to reveal far more than anyone could have anticipated. That evening, a local reporter named Sarah Miller caught wind of Naomi's case. Sarah was known for her keen eye for human interest stories, and Naomi's name piqued her curiosity. With a quick search, Sarah uncovered Naomi's position at the head of the Federal Diversity Initiative. Intrigued, Sarah reached out for a statement, and Naomi agreed to speak with her. What followed was a revealing conversation that painted a far broader picture than anyone had expected. Naomi wasn't just the head of a program. She had been responsible for training thousands of federal employees, reshaping hiring practices, and pushing for legislation that directly impacted workplace diversity across the nation. Her influence in reshaping the public sector was undeniable. This wasn't the type of person who should be dismissed or treated as just another minor defendant in a case. The reporter's article, which would go live the next morning, would change everything. The piece painted Naomi as a strong, accomplished leader who had earned her position through years of hard work. And with it, the subtle implications of Judge Hale's ruling began to take shape. Was this simply a misunderstanding, or was it something more? By the time Naomi went to bed that night, the story was spreading like wildfire. News outlets were picking up the story, and social media buzzed with the revelation of Naomi's leadership role. To some, the story was about the fine. But to others, it became a symbol of something larger, a public reckoning that was just beginning. The morning after the news broke, Naomi woke up to a barrage of notifications on her phone. Texts, emails, and social media mentions flooded in, each one more urgent than the last. Sarah Miller's article had gone viral, and within hours, Naomi's name was trending across multiple platforms. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, each adding their own spin, but the core message remained the same. A prominent leader in federal diversity efforts had been fined by a judge who appeared unaware of her identity or significance. On one hand, Naomi could sense the growing support for her cause. People were rallying around her, not just because of the unjust fine, but because of her position as a trailblazer in diversity and inclusion. Comments poured in from individuals across the country, praising her efforts to make workplaces more equitable. Many expressed outrage at the judge's lack of awareness and his swift, dismissive ruling. Some felt that the fine wasn't just about a parking violation. It was symbolic of a larger problem. A disregard for the accomplishments of people who weren't given the same level of recognition and respect. On the other hand, Naomi knew that with the attention came intense scrutiny. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the power dynamics at play, the assumptions that people made based on her appearance, and the larger conversation around racial and professional equity. Naomi had spent years working to change systems that favored the status quo. But now, she found herself facing a microcosm of that struggle in the form of a court case that on the surface seemed trivial. While Naomi appreciated the support, she also felt the pressure. She didn't want the narrative to become about her alone. She wanted it to be about the larger systemic issues she had been working to address. She quickly realized that she had an opportunity to shine a light on something much more significant than her own experience. Meanwhile, Judge Hale was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. He had known that the case was relatively minor, but he hadn't expected it to escalate into a public controversy. The media had painted him as the villain in this scenario, and the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if he had been too quick to dismiss Naomi. He was no stranger to the importance of fairness, but he had failed to understand the bigger picture. It had been a knee-jerk reaction, one that now felt like a professional misstep. In his own circles, whispers were starting to spread. Colleagues, friends, and even family were texting him, asking about the case. His peers were divided. Some defended him, saying he was simply doing his job, but others raised concerns about his lack of awareness regarding Naomi's stature. The whispers quickly turned into a public conversation, and Judge Hale found himself questioning his own judgment. Naomi, meanwhile, was determined to use this moment to elevate the conversation beyond her case. As the story gained momentum, she began drafting a response, ready to publicly address the larger issues of racial and professional equity that her case had brought to light. In her mind, this was an opportunity to push the narrative in a direction that mattered. What started as a routine court case had now turned into a platform for change, and Naomi wasn't about to let it slip away. By the afternoon, Judge William Hale was feeling the weight of the spotlight. His courtroom, once a place where he felt in control, now seemed like a stage for a far larger drama. His name, alongside Naomi Bennett's, was appearing in news articles and social media posts, often accompanied by sharp critiques of his decision. As he scrolled through the headlines, his stomach churned. Judge finds diversity leader without realizing who she is. One headline read. Another, public outrage after judge's ruling against prominent advocate. Hale was a man of principle. His reputation was built on being a fair and impartial judge. Yet, for the first time in his career, he was unsure whether his actions had truly reflected those values. How had he missed something so important? Naomi had appeared before him like any other defendant, but it wasn't just a fine he had issued. It was a judgment that was now being viewed as a symbol of systemic failure. The critique wasn't just about his ruling on her case. It was about his failure to understand her role in society, the larger movement she represented. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from his assistant, Judge Hale. The voice on the other end said, "There's a meeting scheduled with the media tomorrow morning. They want a statement about the ruling." "Cancel it," Hale replied quickly, his voice tense. He couldn't stand the idea of speaking to the press until he had sorted out what was happening. His mind raced. Did he have the full picture? Had he let his own biases cloud his judgment? He thought back to that day in the courtroom. Naomi had been calm and collected, but when she had spoken about the extenuating circumstances surrounding her parking ticket, something about her tone had hinted that there was more to the story. Yet, instead of digging deeper, Hale had dismissed her explanation as an excuse. In retrospect, that decision felt wrong, even reckless. The media's reaction had compounded his unease. It wasn't just about Naomi's fine. It was about the bigger implications of overlooking someone who had worked tirelessly to advocate for equality. He began to realize how his role, as a judge with the power to shape narratives, had inadvertently become part of the problem. That evening, Hale went to bed with a heavy mind. His reputation was on the line. But more than that, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had failed to see Naomi Bennett for who she truly was, a leader, an advocate, someone whose work was changing lives. He had treated her like just another defendant in his court, when in reality, she was a force for systemic change. The next morning, with little more than a few hours of sleep, Hale sat down at his desk, staring at the phone in front of him. He knew the right thing to do was to make amends, to acknowledge his mistake. But how could he? How could he address this situation without making it worse? There was only one way forward. He had to face Naomi, understand her story, and begin the long process of owning up to his error. What he didn't know was that Naomi, too, had been thinking carefully about how to approach the situation. The next few days would force both of them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. The next day, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she read through the avalanche of messages. Some were from colleagues, offering support, while others were from complete strangers expressing solidarity or sharing their own experiences with unfair treatment. It was overwhelming. But in the midst of all the praise and sympathy, Naomi knew she had a responsibility to guide the conversation in a way that would create real change. This wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about the system that allowed such decisions to be made without question. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was an email from Judge Hale's office, requesting a meeting. Naomi raised an eyebrow. She had expected this moment to come, but it still took her by surprise. The message was polite, even apologetic in tone. It seemed clear that the judge was trying to take accountability for his actions. She read the email again, this time more carefully. The invitation was straightforward. "I'd like to meet and discuss the events surrounding your case. I understand the ruling was made hastily, and I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly." Naomi paused. She had spent the past 24 hours processing the public fallout and deciding what she wanted out of this moment. She could have easily turned down the meeting, choosing to let the media continue pushing her narrative. But Naomi wasn't interested in simply playing a part in the story. She wanted to change the script altogether. This was her chance to help someone understand what so many people like her had been trying to teach for years: the importance of empathy, perspective, and acknowledgement of the systems in place. She replied, agreeing to the meeting, and set a time for that afternoon. When Naomi entered Judge Hale's office, it was clear the atmosphere was different from what she had imagined. Gone was the courtroom's impersonal aura. Instead, the room felt warmer, perhaps a reflection of the judge's genuine desire to make things right. Judge Hale stood up from behind his desk and offered Naomi a seat. His face showed signs of stress, but there was something else there too: genuine regret. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Ms. Bennett," he began, his voice more somber than it had been in court. "I spent the last few days reflecting on my decision, and I realize now that I acted too quickly. I didn't take into account who you are or the impact your work has had. I didn't even give you the respect you deserve." Naomi nodded, her expression measured but not cold. "I appreciate you acknowledging that, Judge Hale. But the reality is, this situation isn't just about one individual case. It's about how people like me are often overlooked, dismissed, or assumed to be just another person in the system. That's how we end up with these kinds of misjudgments." Hale's eyes widened slightly. Naomi could see that the weight of her words was sinking in. "I admit that I didn't see the full picture," he said quietly. "I didn't understand the full scope of your work, or how much your role means to the very communities I serve. I realize now how much I've missed." Naomi leaned forward. "That's part of the problem. People in positions of power often don't understand or take the time to learn about the lives and struggles of those who are trying to make a difference. And when we don't take the time to understand each other, decisions like this happen, decisions that affect more than just the individual." There was a pause as Judge Hale took in her words. For the first time, Naomi saw him as someone who truly wanted to understand, not just defend himself. "I want to do better," he said finally, "not just in my courtroom, but in how I approach my work as a judge and as a person." Naomi smiled, though it was a small smile, one filled with both caution and hope. "This is a good first step, but real change takes more than just words. It takes action." The conversation was long, full of difficult truths and honest admissions, but by the time Naomi left Judge Hale's office, there was a sense of mutual understanding between them, a recognition that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, not only for the judge, but for the system he represented. The media was relentless. News outlets across the country continued to cover Naomi's case, but now the narrative was shifting. The story was no longer just about a judge's decision or Naomi's fine. It had become about the larger issue of accountability, respect, and the potential for change within the systems that govern society. Naomi's voice was no longer just a quiet echo in the background. It had become a call for reform. That same afternoon, Judge Hale sat down at his desk, staring at the statement he had drafted. He had carefully written every word, ensuring it was both sincere and direct. He had always prided himself on making fair decisions in court, but this moment felt different. He had seen firsthand the ripple effect of his actions, the way one seemingly small decision had ignited a larger conversation about fairness, respect, and bias. He knew that to truly make things right, he had to do more than apologize in private. He had to make his apology public. With a deep breath, he sent the statement to his office assistant to release it to the press. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. It wasn't just a matter of saving face. It was about demonstrating that he understood the gravity of the situation. It was about showing Naomi, and the public at large, that he was willing to change. Within hours, the statement went live. "I would like to formally apologize to Ms. Naomi Bennett for my actions during her case. Upon reflection, I realized that my decision was made too quickly, and I failed to take into account the full context of her work and the significance of her role in advocating for diversity and inclusion. I have always strived to be a fair and just judge, but in this instance, I allowed my assumptions to cloud my judgment. For that, I am deeply sorry." The media coverage was swift, and the response was mixed. Some people praised the judge for his honesty and willingness to admit fault. They saw it as a rare moment of humility in a world where leaders were often reluctant to acknowledge their mistakes. Others, however, questioned why it had taken a public outcry for the judge to come to this realization. Why hadn't he recognized Naomi's importance in the courtroom from the beginning? Naomi, for her part, had already read the apology. She wasn't sure what to make of it at first. She appreciated the judge's acknowledgement of his mistake, but she also knew that an apology, while important, was only the first step in a much larger process. In the days following the apology, Naomi decided to speak publicly about her thoughts on the situation. In an interview with a major news network, Naomi spoke about the apology with a measured tone. "I appreciate the judge's willingness to recognize his error, but I also think it's important to remember that this wasn't just about a personal mistake. It was about a system that often overlooks the contributions of people who are working for change. This is bigger than me. It's about making sure that when people show up, they're seen for who they really are, not just through the lens of assumptions or stereotypes." The public response to Naomi's interview was powerful. Many people echoed her sentiments, expressing that while Judge Hale's apology was a positive step, the real work of change was just beginning. Both Naomi and the judge had learned important lessons, but Naomi's voice, strong and steady, was leading the way forward. In the days following Judge Hale's apology and Naomi's public interview, the atmosphere around both of them began to shift. What had started as a minor incident, a simple courtroom decision, had snowballed into a full-fledged public discussion about fairness, bias, and the importance of recognizing the humanity in others. And while some were content with the apology, Naomi knew that true progress would only come through sustained action. For Judge Hale, the experience was transformative. He had always considered himself an impartial judge, making decisions based on facts and law. But in the quiet moments after his public apology, he began to ask himself deeper questions. How many other times had he rushed to judgment without fully understanding the context? How often had he failed to see the people standing before him as more than just cases to be processed? Naomi's words echoed in his mind. "This is bigger than me." He understood now that his role as a judge was not just to rule on individual cases, but to ensure that the systems in place were just and equitable for everyone, regardless of their background. Judge Hale had always prided himself on being fair, but fairness wasn't just about following the law. It was about seeing the whole person. It was about empathy and understanding, something he realized he had lacked in his initial judgment of Naomi. Over the next few weeks, he attended workshops and seminars on diversity, equity, and inclusion, eager to learn more about the systemic issues that had contributed to his misstep. He began reading books and articles on racial bias and privilege, educating himself on the experiences of those who were often marginalized in society. It wasn't easy. Some of what he read challenged his previous assumptions, but he knew it was necessary. Naomi, too, had begun to see the ripple effects of her experience. The public reaction to her case had been overwhelming, and she had used the platform to push forward on the issues she had always cared about. More people were reaching out to her, eager to learn about her work and to discuss ways to create more inclusive spaces in both the public and private sectors. She had been invited to speak at conferences, write op-eds, and even meet with legislators to discuss policy changes. It felt good, but Naomi was careful not to let the attention distract her from the real work that needed to be done. She had always known that true change would come slowly, incrementally. But with the support of people who believed in her mission, Naomi was more determined than ever to push forward. She had spoken to communities that were often overlooked. But now she was reaching people in power, people who could help shake the systems she had spent years fighting to improve. Her voice had grown louder, but so had the voices of others who had long been marginalized. As for Judge Hale, he found himself grappling with his own growth. He began to see how his position could be a powerful tool for change, one that extended far beyond the walls of his courtroom. He understood now that his role wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about shaping a justice system that was truly equitable for all. While he knew his journey was far from over, he was committed to continuing his education and working towards a more just future. The conversation had shifted, yes, but it had also opened the door to lasting change. Both Naomi and Judge Hale knew that the work they were doing together, though not always easy, was vital. They had both learned valuable lessons, and as they continued their individual paths, they knew their stories were intertwined in a larger movement for progress. Months passed, and the conversation that Naomi and Judge Hale had started continued to unfold across the nation. Naomi, now more than ever, felt the responsibility of her position. The media storm had died down, but the work she had dedicated her life to was taking on new urgency. Her platform had grown, and she was using it to advocate for systemic change in ways she had never imagined. With new opportunities to speak at national forums, advise corporations, and collaborate with lawmakers, Naomi felt an even greater sense of purpose. Her meeting with Judge Hale had been pivotal, not just for their personal journeys, but for the broader conversation about justice and equality. While the judge had acknowledged his mistake and sought to educate himself, Naomi knew that change wasn't just about one individual changing their perspective. It was about entire systems rethinking how they operated. As a leader in the Federal Diversity Initiative, Naomi was deeply invested in pushing for policies that would ensure equitable practices at all levels of government. One of her major projects in the months following the incident was spearheading a nationwide initiative to overhaul hiring practices across federal agencies. It was part of a broader push for accountability, transparency, and more diverse representation at every level of government. Naomi was determined to ensure that people of all backgrounds had access to opportunities, not just those who fit a particular mold. Her work was gaining traction, and more allies were joining the movement. Yet she was constantly reminded that the road to change was long and fraught with challenges. Meanwhile, Judge Hale had been quietly making changes in his own life. The workshops he had attended had not just been about the law. They had been about his personal evolution. He began to see the court system with fresh eyes, questioning practices that he had long accepted without thought. He understood now that bias could manifest in subtle, often unrecognized ways, and he was committed to ensuring his courtroom became a space where every person was treated with the respect they deserved. Hale's colleagues noticed the shift in him. His rulings became more thoughtful, more empathetic. He was no longer the judge who simply followed the letter of the law. He was a judge who sought to understand the deeper implications of his decisions. In a bold move, Judge Hale reached out to Naomi again. He wanted to see if they could collaborate on a project, something that could bring together their shared commitment to justice, but also their unique perspectives. After weeks of planning, they announced the creation of a new mentorship program designed to guide young professionals from diverse backgrounds into careers in law, public policy, and government. The program would not only provide mentorship but also offer resources, networking opportunities, and internships to ensure that these young leaders had a clear path toward success. The partnership between Naomi and Judge Hale was symbolic of the progress they had made, both individually and together. Their collaboration wasn't just about fixing a past mistake. It was about actively building something new. It was about acknowledging that while the road to real change was complicated, it was worth traveling together. As they moved forward, both Naomi and Judge Hale knew that this was only the beginning. There were more challenges ahead, more barriers to break, and more work to be done. But for the first time, they truly believed in the possibility of change, and together, they were ready to keep pushing for a more just and equitable future.